It's my great pleasure to introduce Julie Carr today. Julie knew very early in her career that she wants to do journalism. That's really, so she actually graduated from the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism at Arizona State University, but also has a postgraduate diploma from the Caribbean Institute of Mass Communication in Kingston in Jamaica. Then she worked for the United Press International in Phoenix in Arizona. And then she joined the LA Times. And in the LA Times, her first work was actually as a sports journalism, right? In sports. So, then in about 2002, actually, she became an environmental reporter for the LA Times. And in 2009, along with Bettina Boxell, she actually won the Pulitzer Prize for explanatory journalism, especially because of her work, I think, in the wildfires, what causes wildfires in the US, the western part of the US especially. A 5-part series got the Pulitzer Prize. But today she will talk about something else, but I will not take more time away from you and just open the stage for you. Yeah.
Thank you.
Great pleasure to be here. Yeah, I will set it up. Mm-hmm.
Hi, I'm very low tech. I have no PowerPoints. I know, you can leave now. I have nothing to project on the screen. I can barely project my voice. So, and be happy to hear that I don't have a speech prepared, which actually could be frightening for all of us here. But what I'd like to do is tell you about a project I've been working on that I've been asked to speak about, and then be really excited to hear what you all have to say as you work in a field that I just stand on the sidelines and watch. So what I've been doing for the past year and a half has been to report and now write about something we're calling the solar desert. I'm the public lands writer, so I cover the Bureau of Land Management and the Park Service, which is a pretty cool beat, by the way, and public land, of which nearly half of California is owned by the federal government. So out in the Mojave, you have all of this seemingly vacant land that the federal government now would like to open, as it does, for extractive industry. And in this case, it's for utility scale solar, very, very large solar plants using either PV technology or a different kind called concentrating solar, which is kind of an interesting looking thing where you focus a field of mirrors on a receiver, and that receiver heats up either oil or water to about 1,000 degrees. That creates steam, and that runs a turbine. So you have this kind of space-age technology that's running a 19th century kind of thing. It's interesting. So, so I started looking into that with the same way that we all in my business spent 8 years looking at oil and gas in this country under George Bush. And there's really no difference, and to my mind, what's happening now with solar and renewable development and the way in which the government approached using federal lands for prospecting for oil and gas, which is you're in a big rush, you couch everything you do under the guise of security and lessening our reliance on renewable energy. It's been a very long day and not enough coffee, so excuse me. It's lessening our reliance on fossil fuels. You get those things from terrible people. And cheaper, everything that you associate with that. And that means on public lands that you sometimes have to expedite things. You expedite the NEPA and other environmental review processes. You make large swaths of land available. And in the case of the Bureau of Land Management, property, federal property actually that we all own, that is required to be used for multiple purposes, is then relegated to a single use, which in this case that I'm writing about is solar. So it's really not all that different, and lo and behold, it's the same folks who are operating out there. BP, Chevron, Shell, all the same people who are on the oil patch are also doing this stuff. So there's a lot of political power behind this. None of this means it's bad, by the way. It's just, that's how I approached it. It doesn't seem or feel any different to me than the way oil and gas was really, really pushed through and expedited for two terms, George Bush. So that's the way I approached it, and I began to look at it from kind of a purely environmental standpoint, which is what's the footprint of this, what's at stake, what's at risk. The Mojave is a place, it's kind of tough love out there. It's a little easier for people in the environmental world who want to save a coastline or water or big trees or the charismatic megafauna you talk about. Better to save the panda bear than the little fringe-toed lizard or a redwood or than Pearson's milk vetch, a weed. So it's tough to find a constituency for the Mojave, and you run into a lot of people who say, it's particularly in my newsroom, how do you know if it's been destroyed? How do you know if it's been trashed because there's nothing there? So you have to start with quite literally on the ground saying, what's here? What is the biodiversity? What does it support? Why do we care? Because that's a big, I think, a way to, it's not my job to promote environmental causes, but I think it's a very effective thing to have some enlightened self-interest or to tell people why it matters to them. So, and that's true for readers. I need readers to understand that there's something at stake here. And something that can be damaged, and something that it belongs to them, and it's a little fragile, and it's just, purely transparency. So, the first piece I did, whenever it was, just was the overview, looking at a particular project, which is operated by a company named BrightSource Energy, which is an Israeli company that is now based in Oakland, and it uses this power tower technology, which is really fascinating. And there's a big thing that's playing out in solar right now, as is the case with everything in the world. And I know even at your age, it's money. It's all about money. And there's a big shakeout that has to do with PV, photovoltaic, which are just these slabs that absorb the heat and the radiation, versus concentrating solar power, which are mirrors. And so they reflect it, and they use the power in that way. And things are really happening fast. This plant that I began to focus on, I chose because it was the first one out of the gate. When it was proposed, it was 12,000 acres. Now it's about 5 square miles. And so it's very large, and should it be built out, it would be the largest solar power plant in the world. We're always looking for superlatives and hyperbole in my business, so I can say the biggest, the best, the first. And it uses this concentrating solar power. It may be outpaced by what's happening with the Chinese, who have now changed everything. They cornered the market on polysilicon, which is one of the materials that's used for PV technology. Decided to drive the price down, which they can do because they're China. And now photovoltaics are really, really cheap. And if you'd like to put them on your house, you can find out how cheap they are. So that may change things. But so I focused on this one company, this one project. It's right on the border of California and Nevada, right at this really charming town called Primm, which is your first step into Nevada. So they let you know you're there. It's got crummy gambling places and crappy little restaurants, and it's a lot of neon, and you kind of get a sense. I guess we're near Vegas now. So it's right there in a place called the Ivanpah Valley, and so it was a good way for me to anchor the story, keep going off and doing these other pieces, but really look very hard at this particular project. And I spent a lot of time in Needles, which you needn't do if you ever think of going to Needles. Don't. It's got a BLM office and rooms and rooms of boxes of all the materials that are associated with this project, because this is public. This is all public record. Anybody can look at it. It's the beauty of one of the many cool things about living in this country and being a journalist. It's all available. So I spent a lot of time reading through this stuff, copying or scanning it, and so I can have a record of what happened and provide it to you all. So I did the first piece, this big overview, looked at this technology, what this is going to look like, talked to a lot of people who basically said, it's a science project, we really don't know. And that's one of the other interesting things about this. It's never been done at this scale anywhere ever. The countries that are very big into solar, Spain, Germany, as you would know, Wolfgang, they have a lot of it, and these are not sunny places. So this is really where you want to be in the Mojave. There's nothing on the scale that's being proposed. The Bureau of Land Management has a document that will probably be approved by fall that would open up 21 million acres to this kind of development. That's a lot, if you know, in case you're wondering. It's an awful lot. And it doesn't mean that it will be everywhere, by no means, but it's a signal. It's a signal to industry. We're open for business, and it is very much for people who are interested in renewable energy. I can tell you, President Obama is a lot of wonderful things. He is not an environmental president, but I would say his signature environmental initiative is definitely renewable energy, and that has been reinforced by the Secretary of Interior, you just made it entirely clear that this is what he's going to go forward with, carrying this agenda for the president. So, and the second piece I did looked at how all of this is going to affect property prices. And here's why. As I said, we don't think of ourselves as an ag state or kind of a rural state, or a lot of Californians think we have nothing in common with Nevada and Arizona. We have a lot in common. We were part of the American West, and part of the legacy of being an American Western state is that you have a lot of federal land. So when a project is placed in the Mojave, and it's also the Colorado Desert, but it's a lot easier to say the Mojave. If it impacts, or to the degree to which it impacts, let's say, an endangered species, like the desert tortoise, which is this poor little guy that time forgot. I don't know how he's made it, but he's got he's about this big. When he's born, he's like this. They have between a 90 to 98% mortality. They get crushed, they get eaten, their mothers lose them. I mean, I don't know how they make it. But these guys are a threatened species. And as you know, you can't even give the stink eye to a threatened species because you've now bothered them, you've harassed them, it's a take, and it's a big deal. So a lot of these projects are smack dab in the middle of habitat for animals and plants. I tend not to write about the plants, and I get in a lot of trouble for that, but they're there and I love them. But it's easier to write about the animals because you can anthropomorphize, and then people like that. So to the degree to which they take away habitat for these endangered species, they must replace it. And California is a very expensive place to do business in this regard. The federal government requires a one-to-one. So if you remove 100 acres of desert tortoise habitat, and it's been identified as such, you must somewhere find another 100 acres of desert tortoise habitat, or in the case of the federal government, they allow you to do other things. But the California government, under CEQA and under the way in which this is managed, it's 3-to-1. The California Energy Commission, which is another layer of the bureaucracy that these developers have to deal with, sometimes decide it's 5-to-1. So you're Bob Joe developer, which would never be your name, it'd be Robert Joseph, something limited. You come in and you say, it's federal land, I practically get it for free, which is why they're choosing federal land. Different story with private. It's practically for free. I'm liking this. Because this is early days in renewable energy, federal government hasn't thought about, maybe we ought to charge something along the lines of a royalty for this, because you're taking a resource. There are states that believe that rain, Colorado says that rain that falls from the sky, you may not collect because that's a resource that belongs to the state. And, it's an interesting discussion. So this is, you're squatting on public land for free, nobody else gets to use it. You're getting this resource for free. There's this whole issue of subsidies, which we can go into, that would drive you completely nuts, because you're all broke, because you're college students. It will drive you completely nuts. So we've bailed them out. We've given them up to 80% free financing on our dime, federally guaranteed loans. They're sitting there. And then, of course, we will naturally be charged for this power at a rate that's pretty astronomical. But so you're squatting on this land, and now you've got to suddenly find, in the middle of vast swaths of public property, you've got to find private land. And it's a fascinating thing. I mean, I'm not saying the story was fascinating, but when you understand how the checkerboard of land ownership in the West is, and this belongs to Ma and Pa Kettle, who are out there in the double wide trailer, and by God, they're going to live the rest of their lives, and they love how quiet it is. And this piece belongs to the Bureau of Land Management, and this is part of this belongs to the National Park Service because it's in the Mojave Preserve, and this piece belongs to a family in Rhode Island that their great-grandfather got, and they've been paying the taxes on, and would they ever love to get rid of it? And then there's a guy with a mining claim. It's completely nuts. So these companies are now required to go out and find this land, put it together through land brokers, and say to federal officials, here's the mitigation land to make up for the land we're taking away from our poor little desert tortoise, which they hate. So I did a story about how those people now think, Ma and Pa Kettle in the desert are sitting on a gold mine, or believe they are. And what their expectations are, land that was worth $100, $500 an acre. This is not ag land. It doesn't have water. It doesn't have minerals. It doesn't have much unless you love the desert. It's now worth 5,000, 10,000 acres or more, depending who wants it and how much they're willing to pay, which is always the case with real estate. So I did that story. Then I did a desert tortoise story, which was mildly sympathetic to the companies that are doing this development. You could say, boo-hoo, stop complaining. You chose to work here. You knew what you were dealing with, and this is the cost of doing business. But BrightSource, this company, has spent and projects it will spend $50 million just to deal with the desert tortoise. It's pretty astonishing. And if you want a really strong kick-ass, I guess I can say in college, if you want a strong environmental law, look at the Endangered Species Act. There's equally strong efforts to tear it apart and do all kinds of things. I wrote a story today about a bill in Congress that that would take 100 miles of the northern border with Canada and the southern border of Canada on all the federal land, which is to say all of those national parks and all of the wildlife refuges and all of that, and give that to the Department of Homeland Security so that it could override and supersede any law. There's about 37 different environmental laws and cultural resource laws, et cetera, so that they can protect us from whatever comes across the border. So there's lots of assaults on these laws, but they're written. They are really cool. They're very, very strong laws. So the Endangered Species Act is really strong. So for the desert tortoise, and I just talked to a construction worker the other day who got fired from this plant, when they were clearing, they had to do a clearance for desert. They had to say, how many desert tortoise are there? And these are guys who make a living by hiding, and they don't want to be found. It's not their job to be found. They go in their little carports, I call them. Desert tortoises, they have the hump on the back, and their little holes looks like, they go in like that, and you can just say, there's no disguising, there's no nothing. It's a desert tortoise. They just kind of walk in. Anyway, they're very, very vulnerable guys, except for the back and this incredibly pungent urine. It's not urine, but it's a excretion. They pee when they get scared, and it's apparently appalling, even to a coyote, which is saying quite a lot. So that's their protection. They've got their shell on their back, which doesn't really mature until they get to be really old, and then they pee on you. And that's it. That's all they got. But these guys are hundreds of millions of years old. So they did a clearance, and they said, okay, biologists walked around and said, how many desert tortoises are there? And then they extrapolate, because they say, we know you're hiding, and then they do all this analysis. When this analysis was done on this project, it was a drought year. Nobody thought about that. Like a lot of wildlife, the moms say, have physiological changes, and they say, I'm not going to have offspring this year because they're not going to make it. It's too stressful for me. They'll never make it. There's nothing in this environment. There's no food, no water, whatever it is. And they know it, and they just call it a day. These guys are the same way. And desert tortoises are bizarre. The guys, every time they see each other, they fight. The females and the males are like, "Nyeh," and then okay, I have to, and then they mate. And the gender is determined by temperature. So it's so bizarre. The way you look at it is, and I think I'll probably have it exactly wrong, but it doesn't matter because it's the same outcome. The hotter it is, I'll say there's more females. So they're going to be goners anyway with climate change, because it's going to be a bunch of females saying, okay. But there's not going to be a species to make it. But anyway, so they did this survey in a year in which there were astounding number of low number rather. Then they said, okay, we're not really concerned. There's going to be 6 or so turtles. And an interesting thing I found out, they don't count the juveniles, because they're just like, you don't really count until you're big enough to fend for yourself. And that can be almost 20 years that they have sexual maturity. So there might have been some little ones running around, but they didn't count them because they're kind of insignificant, because they just assume they're going to die, which is their sad life. So they started construction following a very, very unexpected wet year. Place was lousy with desert tortoises. Everywhere you went, everywhere. So when they started just even building roads, they have the guy in the truck with the hard hat, and they had to hire like all of the West Coast's available desert tortoise biologists. This is such a great thing for biologists. Everybody got a job. You guys, it's still going to happen. Go get a job. It's amazing. So, and you're being paid by this really rich company. So they're wearing their orange vests, hard hats, in case a desert tortoise flew up and hit them in the head. And the guy's driving, and you could not drive a vehicle without it being escorted by a biologist on either side. And it sounds goofy, and if we were in a different setting, people would be laughing and saying, "Oh, environmentalists!" They are so hard to find. They're cryptic, as they like to say, hard to find, and little. So it's what you needed to do. If you crush it, the implications of harming a desert tortoise on that site were such that it made so much more sense economically to hire whoever, to crawl across the place to find them than it did to crush one and everything comes to a standstill, which eventually happened. So my story was about what they have to do, what is involved in desert tortoise mitigation, and to tell readers, if we want an Endangered Species Act, which we did, I don't know how much more we want it is an impediment to development in some circumstances. It is taken very seriously, and it costs a lot of dough. And that's where you come up with the shoot, shovel, and shut up. If it's on private property and you find that you've got a San Joaquin kit fox, they're just adorable, but it's an endangered species. You might let the dog out, and you want that animal to not be there because you can't do whatever it is you want to do. They kill it, they bury it, and then kit fox? What kit fox? That's what happens. That's how it operates in the West if you're on private property. On public lands like that, it's a little harder because there's some sense of what animals should be there. And anyway, so I wrote about how this company mitigated and what it had to do. It has to provide 50 miles of fencing, which the calculation was, it was $50,000 a mile. It's another thing. Desert tortoise fencing is not the same as other fencing. It has to be buried because these guys go under. It's kind of their world. They say, okay, they're very funny guys. They walk along, and then there's a road, and whoa, and they stop, and they can just sit there and think about it for a really long time, and then, or whatever they do. If they come to a fence, right under, and they go. And so this thing had to be 17 inches below the ground. It had to be a certain grid, and it's one of those deals. I am so sure that a manufacturer of fencing said, here's a desert tortoise fencing, it has to be this gauge. It's like, if you buy the fencing at Home Depot, it's $1.50, but if it's desert tortoise fencing, it is $932. That's how it is. An aspirin at the emergency room, that's how it is. So that's really expensive. They now have moved every desert tortoise off this site And there's a little nursery for them. It just looks like the desert. And they have these kind of runs, and they separate the juveniles, and they call it a Head Start program. And this is good experience of greenwashing, because this is what happens. Everything's cute. And in fact, all of the workers who are out there have their hard hats on, and there's a decal on the side that shows they've had training, which is taken quite seriously, because again, it's a big deal. You don't want to harm these things. And the decal is a desert tortoise with a hard hat on. And it proves that you have undergone the proper training so that you have a right to work out there. So they now are responsible for the care and feeding of these guys. We don't know how long. And an interesting thing that's happened with this project that I think I've never seen with the, it takes out the, it extends the responsibility for endangered species until the end of their lifespan. Normally, you say, okay, here's a golden eagle, I've saved him, and off you go, Godspeed, and you just throw him up in the air, and like this. This is the first time I've ever seen this. They've decided, all of the various agencies that are responsible for permitting and overseeing this work, have decided that this is a very long, we know it's a long-lived species. It's 100, 120 years, it depends. This company is now going to put them through school. They're just going to, it's forever. They're going to be living at home with mom and dad, because these guys were responsible for paying for their well-being. And it's a very interesting thing, and to be in a kind of environmental science point for you all. It's interesting how this worked. This is the first time also that instead of saying, here's this population of desert tortoise, we're going to put them over here, as if they're going to really like their new home. We live in the valley, we don't want to live on the west side. This is how they are. They spend, when they're moved, these guys are so persnickety, they will spend all their time, day and night, going back where they came from. That's just how they are. They have a homing instinct. And a biologist explained it to me, if I drop you off in, she said, Kansas City, aren't you going to try to get, I said, Kansas City, of course I'm going to try to get back to LA, what do you think? But what she meant was, where all of your food sources are, where your home is, your neighborhood. And that they want to go back to their neighborhood, not because they did their house up nice and they just put the new roof on and stuff. They know where shade is. They know all of their prey species. They know how to protect themselves. They know where their food is. Blah blah. So that's hugely, hugely strong. Whereas a lot of other animals will say, "Yeah, this is nice. I'll stay here." And in fact, some seek it out about this time of year when the young of the year, especially the young males, okay, get out, and they have to go find their own home range, and they're very adept at that. Desert tortoise are not like that. So this is the first time that they're going to translocate, it's called, these desert tortoise, and they're going to look at the impact of those tortoises on their new habitat. Maybe they have a disease, because these guys get upper respiratory infections. They're just such little babies. There's so much dust now in the desert because the cryptobiotic crust has been disturbed, and there's so much construction and development, and for lots of reasons. They get upper respiratory infections, and they really are unable to deal with them. So maybe they're going to bring their sickness and their illness to this other population. So now BrightSource is going to have to pay to monitor that population that it's going to, and there's a control group. So there's 3 different populations. I mean, it'll be by far the most study of a desert tortoise ever in American history, which in and of itself is a pretty cool thing if you care about these guys. So that's a good outcome for the desert tortoise. So that was the other story, and I just did a story for which I have now a very large thing painted on my back. What's it called? Target? Thank you. I wrote about why I was noticing that the large environmental groups in the country, the Sierra Club, Defenders of Wildlife, Wilderness Society, and the NRDC, were more or less sitting on the sidelines for what is, without question, the largest industrial development in the American West, period. I mean, we started thinking, oh no, railroads, and thought this is, certainly in modern times, potential. And I thought, why are these guys who sue all the time, this is, depends on who you are, but different groups, they all have their strategies. Why are they not weighing in, at least more publicly? They certainly have different pathways, and sometimes they're a bit more discreet. But it wasn't enough to say that they weren't speaking out. I wanted to try to understand why, because that's, of course, a bit more interesting, usually. So I wrote a story about, what I found out was that right now, and again, money, right now, the money that's available for grants, which is how a lot of entities make a living. These, various institutes here, you have to get dough, because we are not paying for it. Taxpayers and our legislators just don't want to fork it out, so you have got to get money, and it's all about grants. Right now, in the world of environmental grant making, the number one and number two issues are climate change and energy. And that has changed in the last 5 years. Those were at the bottom. I mean, it used to be things like biodiversity, which is no less important now than it, you think with climate change, that's even more important. But the number one and two in environmental grant making, grant giving, the number one and two issues are climate change and energy, renewable energy. So I started noticing that groups that were, friends of the Chuckawalla Valley suddenly became friends supporting the Chuckawalla Valley because it could be destroyed by climate change. And, people who would say watershed protectors and also in favor of renewable energy. So everybody was trying to portray themselves, everybody out there trying to get grant money, portraying themselves as very, very interested in climate change and having a nexus in whatever it was that they were interested in and advocates for. That had to have a nexus for climate change. And you absolutely cannot be perceived as being against renewable energy in any form because you're not going to get the dough. And that left the playing field to small, not unsophisticated, but small groups that don't have the litigation money, don't have the litigation background or wherewithal, and that's sometimes what it takes, and couldn't fly to Washington for meetings, much less Sacramento for these various meetings, and they were kind of, they didn't have a seat at the table, which was the metaphor that everybody kept using. And so I wrote about how the dialogue, how the I can't think of a better way. The talking points on renewable energy or solar in the desert were written then by these groups that some people would say were co-opted by these large companies through donations and other kinds of funding, but more to the point, groups that came to the table and said, we are for renewable energy. We know that it like anything, there are some downsides to it, but better this than coal-fired power plants, better this than more fossil fuels, and the horror if you take the end game of climate change. So that's not a very popular thing. It certainly wasn't popular with these groups. And they would say, and have said, they have made really, really difficult, agonizing decisions. They are not, the Sierra Club, the NRDC, they don't sit down with developers all the time. These are the very kinds of projects that they would be screaming about, save the Mojave. But they just made a calculation that in the scheme of things, the Mojave is going to get it hard with climate change anyway. And the desert tortoise is going to have to keep moving up in its habitat to find an amenable place to live. And it can't go up there, It can't. Its habitat is the Clark Mountains, and it can't live at altitude. So they've made this difficult calculation, and they find themselves agreeing with developers and signing on to letters, and it's the kind of thing that makes them uncomfortable. But it's a real shift, and I would argue that they would argue otherwise, but I would say there's a lot of evidence that says that they, rather than getting the money, and I don't want to say it so crassly, they just don't want to be perceived as being in opposition of renewable energy. And I take their point. And right now I'm working on a story that that looks at the technology itself, which is we have these things called budgets that tell what's coming. This is a series that's going to go on for the rest of my life, I think. But so I'm saying what these stories are, and this one's called the WTF, and I'll when you take a look at the scale of these projects, just each one, on a human level, on however you care to look at it, they're amazing. There's a lot of amazing technology. A lot of it is quite cutting edge, and again, changing all the time. But they have a lot of impacts in addition to the environmental ones. The space it takes. There's a certain amount of water associated with some of the technology, water use, all the animals. But I'm looking at, again, my BrightSource one. So you have 173 heliostats. They're 20 meters, so it's about like this. It's extremely reflective. I mean, its whole point is to be reflective and reflect light. And a field of these things in a big circle, and in the middle is a tower that's 459 feet rising from the ground. And at the top is a receiver, and it has water in it. And all of these heliostats through the day are electronically controlled or computer controlled, and they all perfectly, it's a tropism, and they all move as the sun moves through the sky and focus on this receiver. And that will heat water to 1,000 degrees, about 550 Celsius, run through the series of pipes, run a turbine, and that turbine is what provides the solar energy, which is kind of interesting. Part of the time, because you have to get that thing heated in the morning, it's kind of like their kickstart, it's going to be a gas-fired power plant. They're going to use natural gas to heat that water. When clouds come over, because you can't have an interruption, they're going to use natural gas to heat that water. At the end of the day, when you want to provide power to the grid, when you can get more money for it, because that's when utilities need it, because that's when we go home, turn everything on, that's when you get more money for your power, and that's when solar guys are starting to crank down. They're going to run it on, it's going to use gas to heat the boiler. So it's partially a gas-fired power plant, and part of the time, most of the time, certainly, running on this. So I wanted to look at what is it going to look like. It's right next to I-15. So you're driving from, our scenario was you're driving southwest from Vegas to LA on I-15 after a weekend. You might be a little bleary, and it's the summer, and you're driving into the sun. And you've got this giant power plant. What's it going to look like? So I've talked to a guy today. You'll be happy to know that there is a world's foremost expert on glint and glare, and he lives in Massachusetts, and I spoke to him, and he was lovely. That's the power. I mean, the potential for problems are great, but these guys are, of course, they've been permitted by the Energy Commission, so it must be okay. Well, you don't want to be a bird, that's for starters. The McCarran Airport, that's the Vegas airport, so it's the Clark County Aviation Authority, the FAA, and the Department of Defense, on behalf of both the Air Force and the Marines, oppose this tremendously because they had a couple quick questions. We're flying over this thing. What does it look like? And answers were provided that they were not pleased with, not in the depth that they required. More information back and forth. And the second is, so you have 1,000 degrees here. There's a heat plume that comes off that, and there's a heat plume that comes off these cooling, these turbines. They have to be cooled. And that creates turbulence. What happens when you fly over that? What does that do to radar? What does that do for all kinds of things? And this is the very part of the United States where the Department of Defense trains all the pilots to fly really close to the ground. They don't want a 45-story building, suddenly, or 3 of them in the case of this popping up. It's kind of dangerous. And so these are just kind of simple questions that have, to answer them, there's a lot of science, like 9 miles above my head. But, I talk to the people who then tell me. So that's what I'm writing about. The I won't say unintended consequences, but in real life, what's this going to look like? Is it going to be when you're driving down the highway? Is it dangerous? Is it a distraction? I mean, on what level is it a public safety issue when you're flying, or should you be just a private pilot? What are the implications? And this writ large, because there are many of these things, and that's the next story. And then I'll write about this issue of subsidies, which is really what it's all about. How did this all get started? Why is there such a rush? Money. It's an industry whose leaders will tell you we are still very, very dependent on subsidies. And that's not unusual. It happens everywhere in the world. And we subsidize a lot of stuff, including oil and gas, tremendously. And they seem to be making pretty good dough. But it's a fascinating kind of closed loop that companies like Goldman Sachs that we bailed out, then got ERA funds because they were invested in these renewable energy thing. Then they got guaranteed loans from the Department of Energy, and now we're going to pay them for this power. And you're thinking, if you ever, again, too young, but if you played Monopoly, there's a little guy who sits there and his pockets are turned out. And he's like, That's what the taxpayer is in a lot of this stuff. That you're just thinking, are we paying these guys 2 and 3 and 4 times for this stuff? It's kind of hard to imagine. And then I'll write eventually about the kind of the elephant in the room, which is why, which is your question earlier. Why is this even necessary? Gee, can't we just put solar panels on top of the roofs and solve the whole problem? And darn good question. Money. Who doesn't want, what entity in California doesn't want solar power on top of everyone's roof? Who doesn't want you to stop being a consumer and actually providing power to the grid that they'll have to pay you for? So, big utilities. It's a very simplistic way of looking at it, but it's a big part of it. I mean, distributed generation, point of use, and all of these ways of looking at, particularly solar on rooftops here on this campus, for example, be very interesting, and I hope you write your story. You have someone from the Daily Bruin who's looking into this and having a lot of trouble because nobody wants to talk about it because it involves money and power and all those different things. Power in every sense. And I cannot believe I've talked this long. So, so that's what I'm working on, and I'd really love to hear anything you guys have to say.
Thank you.